Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Will. It's true, I've come to pay tribute to you, to honor you, because what you've done here in Vermont is so vital, not just to the future of Vermont or this country, but the world. It was mentioned that this was a grassroots bill. And it's from the grassroots we're going to be able to bring change. Not only is there a challenge to the GMO labeling bill, you're having elections on terms that no democracy should tolerate, which is the rule of money and the rule of corporations. And you have brought a concrete challenge to defend the rights and freedoms of people and care for the environment and care for this planet. I want to, of course, thank Will and Kate for organizing these 2 days. I want to thank my very dear friend Jean, whom I was going to visit these 2 days. But instead of being with her in a house in South Hadley, Jean's here with us. And my beloved son, Kartike, who's been driving since yesterday evening when I arrived. So thank you to all, and thank you all for putting your energies to do something that money blocked in California and Washington and is trying to block right now in Colorado and Oregon. And there are advantages of being small. The biggest advantage of being small is you get forgotten. And out of that, you can spread the wings of freedom. At this particular moment, we desperately need these wings because it's around food that all colonization, all totalitarianism is being established. Food, which is the very basis of life, it's the currency of life. Food is the energy that supports the life of all life forms and is what connects us to all life on this earth. That is becoming the site of control, the site of profits, the site of creating a world that is so unreal that if we accept it, life itself will not be possible. That's why what you've done here in Vermont is so significant for the future of life on Earth and the future of democracy. Because here in Vermont, there's a very direct, not an indirect contest between people's freedoms and the right to protect their health, their freedom, and the environment, and corporate freedom to destroy all of it. To destroy the planet, to destroy health, and of course to take away our democratic rights. And this on totally false grounds. I was reading the challenge which the Center for Food Safety kindly sent me because I wanted to be a little informed before I came here. And so they begin with the fact that one way to raise plant varieties is to have genetically modified crops through biotechnology to be more productive and to be more climate resilient. Now, neither of those claims are true. Genetic engineering cannot increase the yield of a crop. That comes from conventional breeding. Either a farmer's variety or something bred by university scientists or by older seed companies. All that genetic engineering does is put a gene that doesn't belong to that organism through the tools of genetic engineering, which basically allow you to move genes across species boundaries, and therefore allow introduction of genes which would never have been present in that crop or food or plant through reproduction. Natural reproduction, including breeding with human intelligence. Rice is bred with rice, wheat is bred with wheat, corn is bred with corn. You now have genes from soil organisms that are producing toxins in plants, that's the Bt family, and other sets of toxic genes to resist more toxics, which is the herbicide-tolerant family. That's it. Even before genetic engineering started to get introduced, the industrial system of agriculture was already a failure in food security, a burden on the planet, and starting to become a major burden for our health. This is the year of family farming, and the United Nations has released data this year that most of the food actually comes from small farms, another place where smallness is an advantage. It does not come from large industrial farms. Large industrial farms are anyway not part of a food system. They're part of an input-output system where you put in toxic chemicals, you put in fossil fuels, you put in a lot of energy, you put in a lot of chemicals, and you get out commodities and a lot of pollution. Only 30% food comes from these industrial farms. And as far as GMOs are concerned, most GMOs cultivated on the planet are corn and soya. Only 10% corn and soya being grown today is going for human food. The rest is going for biofuel and animal feed. So it's not a food system. It's not a food system in terms of the ecological principles, because the web of life is a food web. We realize that when you look at the soil, that the life of the soil is the web of life in the soil. Above ground, the web of life is the amazing work of symbiosis between plants and insects, and between plants and animals. If we didn't have pollinators, we would be losing about 1/3 of our food production. And there is now enough evidence that between pesticides and GMO crops, pollinators are being killed. There was a study done in Cornell in the late 90s, I think, which fed monarch butterfly pollen from Bt corn and pollen from non-Bt corn. And the larvae of the butterfly died when they were fed the Bt pollen. The monarch butterfly needs the milkweed, which is being killed through the sprays of Roundup for Roundup Ready crops. And the population is down to 1/10 of what it used to be. Mexico, which is the home of corn, where a wild plant was transformed into the thousands of varieties of corn, and where the Mexicans think of themselves as the people of corn, they are trying so hard to keep GMO corn from coming in. There was an attempt, I think, last year. Monsanto wanted to plant GM corn on 6 million acres at one go. And it took protests and a court case to stop it. But the monarch butterfly is also disappearing. The two big symbols of sacredness, the butterfly and the corn, are both vanishing. And they're just like the contest here. The contest is between life in diversity, beauty, freedom, and abundance versus a structure that knows only one expertise, the expertise to kill. It's not an accident that most of the ecological destruction of the planet is rooted in an industrial model of agriculture. Something most people don't realize. In 1995, the United Nations organized a conference on plant genetic resources to assess the loss of diversity. And the country assessments came in. 75% of the diversity in agriculture was gone because of industrial agriculture. And we're talking 95. That's pre-WTO, it's pre-globalization, it's pre the deployment of GMO monocultures in all of Argentina, all of Brazil, all of the United States, all of Canada, and in the cotton areas of India. If you turn to water, in some countries it's 90%, but on an average 75% water is going for industrial agriculture and irrigation. And when I fly over the states, especially the western part, you realize how much water is being used, where in the desert they're trying so hard to grow crops, even in a year of drought. And then comes the soil, because the entire system is based on toxic chemicals. Those toxic chemicals are killing the life and structure and fertility of the soil. When I used to, in my early days, train farmers on organic farming, I would take earthworms and take a little pinch of urea, which is the nitrogen fertilizer, and sprinkle a tiny bit, and they could start to see what happens to the earthworms. Because these are salts. And they'll kill the earthworm, but they're killing everything else. We did a study on what's happening to the soils in the BT cotton area. And within 4 years of planting, 22% beneficial soil organisms had been killed, including the soil organisms that degrade the biomass to turn it into minerals and allow crops to take it up. There was a period where animals were grazing on these BT cotton fields, and 1,800 died. And the government veterinary department did the autopsies and said, there's toxic. There was toxic in the digestive tract, and the biomass hadn't been digested. And I talked to some of the scientists and I said, could it be that the soil organisms that digest biomass in the soil are being killed, and soil organisms in our gut, or the gut of the animals, are being killed, or the beneficial bacteria are being killed? And there is more and more data now coming out that whether it's BT toxins or glyphosate in Roundup-resistant crops, the damage to our gut is huge. You have an epidemic in this country on children having intestinal problems. And what we continue to say is this needs to be analyzed. This needs to be looked at. So 75% of the basic soil water biodiversity impacted, and 40% of the greenhouse gases come from industrial globalized agriculture. Combination of carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and methane. We could cut it all. The entire Kyoto Protocol, which ends 2015 is when they will need a follow-up treaty for it, it was aiming at 5% reduction through emissions trading, 5%. Emissions have gone up 17%. But we could cut 40% by shifting to ecological agriculture, the transformation whose foundations you are laying with your commitment. And because there's a continuum between the health of the soil and health of the planet and our health, we can't separate this. The violation to the health of the planet is transforming into violation of our health. there are some scientists who look at this. There are some countries who allow their scientists to look at it. This country does not. I was engaged in the negotiations on biodiversity. At the Earth Summit in 1992, 2 international treaties were signed. One was for the protection of diversity of species. The other was for mitigating climate change. One is called the Convention on Biodiversity. The other is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The IPCC report has just, IPCC, which is the intergovernmental body of scientists, has just issued its report on how there's a 95% certainty of human action causing the current instability. I don't call it climate change because I don't think there's anything predictable about it. I call it climate chaos and climate disruption. So in '92, my government asked me to advise it to look at this agreement, and I did, and I worked with many other governments in the process, and we managed to get into the treaty a biosafety clause, the impact of GMOs on biodiversity. It's Article 19.3 of the treaty. The UN then appointed an expert group to elaborate what this would look like, and I was appointed on that expert group. Out of it came what is called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Most of the world has implemented this protocol. But senior President Bush walked out of signing the treaty, said, "I will not let my biotechnology industry be impacted." Came back and asked his vice president to spell a very difficult word, which is the foundation of the challenge that is being made by the industry bodies. And the word is called substantial equivalence, which basically means assume a naturally occurring organism is like a genetically modified organism, which then translates into don't look, don't see, don't find, and be ignorant about issues of safety. And not having looked, the declaration is repeatedly made, there's no proof of hazards. Of course, if you're not going to look for hazards, where will you find the problems? Biosafety is technically defined in the UN treaty as having 3 kinds of impacts which need to be looked at. The impact of GMOs on the environment, which includes on other plants, the cross-pollination, the contamination, the impact on pollinators, the impact on soil organisms, and wherever this impact has been looked at, it's there. Contamination and cross-pollination is inevitable. This country experienced the contamination of wheat and rice through the trials. But there are other aspects that are intimately related to the success or failure of the technology itself. And these should be seen as aspects of biosafety. The fact that when a new gene is introduced in a plant and a new function is introduced, the ecosystem changes. The relationship with other species changes. And in the case of herbicide resistance, the evolution of resistance leads to resistant weeds, which is now you have the situation of Roundup being useless in controlling weeds and new crops being approved, which are resistant to 2,4-D, the ingredient of Agent Orange. And in fact, it was as an alternative to 2,4-D that Roundup Ready crops were evolved. There's no way on a planet where everything's alive, on a planet where everything's in interaction, on a planet where things are evolving, and even Pope Francis a few days ago said, evolution is real. Now that's something the biotech industry hasn't yet got. For them, there's nothing like evolution. Those weeds evolving with resistance are evolving the resistance. And they need probably a lesson from the Pope now. But they need another lesson from the Pope. And that is related to the fact that the genetically modified organisms are released for one purpose alone, which is to collect royalties from the seeds. Everything else is an excuse. It's basically the patent issue and the royalty issue that is at the heart of the matter. And I was very fortunate to have been invited to a meeting in 1987, where the industry, which used to be the industry that produced war chemicals, after the war they became the agrochemical industry, telling us without chemicals we can't grow food, and then we had to build the organic movement, now telling us without GMOs we can't feed the world. The same industry. And they were talking about how they needed to deploy GMOs in order to collect patents, in order to claim that they had created something new. Yeah? Now, when they claim invention and ownership of life, they're saying we've done something new. This organism is not like any other organism in the world. And then when you manage democratically with your resilience and your collective strength to pass a labeling law, they turn to your courts and say, no, it's absolutely equivalent. This is natural. I call this double stance, where the same organism is an invention and the same organism is natural. I call it ontological schizophrenia. And the ontological schizophrenia is right through the legal challenge. Right through the legal challenge. They continue to talk about how genetic engineering produces plants that do not entail a difference in the food it produces. It does. It does. Because the issue is not material equivalence, which is meaningless when what you're changing are genes. What you need to see is genetic inequivalence. And a molecular biologist just sent me a paper he's written, and he said, because you worked on quantum theory, he's called it the quantum theory of living organisms or something like that. Brilliant paper. I just want to share with you one line. The main actor of the time, the main actor in evolution of an organism is not the ensemble of molecules, but the ensemble of their correlations. It's the relations that shape evolution. So they don't know evolution, and they don't know about relationships. But more importantly, when I say there's a double ontological confusion taking place here, when I was reading these challenges, there's para 61, it says, it is a complete ban on free speech. And coming from India, where this language is not yet established, we don't have a Citizen United decision, this sounds insane. Yeah? Because a corporation is basically a legal construction given permission basically by society via the state that's supposed to represent society. And the charter for corporations is premised on the fact that corporations work with permission of society. And they work for the larger good. And they work when they start to shift from the larger good. Society has the right to withdraw the permission. And what you're doing here in Vermont, by saying you have the right, is to slightly help the world realize that a corporation is a fiction and their free speech is a construct, and we can't afford to be governed by fictions and abstractions and constructions when there's a real world in which people live and die. Will mentioned how in 2000 there were 20,000 suicides, and that public hearing was the first that made the issue really public. Before that, the governments would say, oh, they must have committed suicide, they were, because the farmer must have been an alcoholic or an adulterer. And I said, even if they are, why don't you find out why so many are becoming alcoholics and adulterers to end up committing suicide? But when we started to add those figures and bring the families of the victims, including the young men who had sold their kidneys, the figure now is 291,000 on last year's figures on the basis of 2030. So it is definitely crossed 300,000 now. And I want to just go through what really happens in such a situation. Because I mentioned the first impact of biosafety is the environment. The second impact is health, public health. And the third impact is socioeconomic conditions. Now, we have indications of the public or of the environment. Europe has done the most wide-ranging studies on the impact on health. The first study done was with Arpad Putsai, who visited at that same public hearing. And we honored him with a Gandhi Award because of the way the industry had hounded him out of his lab and his job. He didn't expect to see harm. But when his 3-month study on rats showed that GMO potatoes were leading to a shrinkage in the size of the brain, enlargement of the pancreas, destruction of the immunity, and intestinal damage, the photographs of his study actually show the walls of the intestine getting damaged. He called his director and said, this is serious. If people eat this food all their lives, there could be huge implications. So they held a press conference, announced it, and from the US, pressure came on Tony Blair, and his entire lab, the top scientist on lectins of his time, lab was shut down. He's gone back to Hungary. He said, I left the Soviet Union for freedom. I'm going back to my country, Hungary, for freedom. More recently, a French scientist, Eric Seralini, did a 2-year study, not been done. Most studies are 3-month studies. He did a 2-year study, and he's a toxicologist. He found organ failures, but he found something he wasn't looking for, huge occurrence of tumors. And because he'd seen other scientists suffer, he was very careful about not going to the press before his study was published in the Journal of Food and Chemical Toxicology. One day, this study was all over the internet, being cited, and rats with tumors, all over the pictures were showing. And then the attack started. First, they said the number of rats was too small. He replied, Monsanto used fewer rats. They said the species of rats used were wrong. He said, these are the lab rats that are used in every study, including the Monsanto studies. But of course, industry has a way of spreading rumors on false basis. They then put pressure on the journal, retract a study, something that's not done in science. Once a scientist has done work and it's published through peer review, it's there. Someone else can do a better study, a different study, and establish something else. But retraction is not the culture of the evolution of science. They kept on putting pressure. The journal refused. They said, sorry, you're attacking the integrity of not just Dr. Seralini, but all the scientists who peer-reviewed his study, and our own journal. So what do? They just replace the editor with a Monsanto man, Dr. Goodman. And then he retracts the study. Seralini still published his study in another journal. So what we are seeing is not just harm to other life forms, harm to human beings, potential harm to human beings, which needs to be studied. That's all we say in biosafety. That's what you're saying with your labeling law. You're saying, let there be labeling so people can choose, and meantime, let independent assessments and evaluations take place. And if 10 years down the line, independent studies say, go ahead, there's nothing too serious, people themselves will call for something else. That's democracy. But the attack on science is an attack on our knowing what's going on with the changes. In a living system, because it's a self-organized, complex organism, any addition and any deletion has huge impacts on the function and structures of that system. And to go against this fundamental scientific principle to say we won't look, and adding something doesn't change anything, it's substantially equivalent. That is a highly unscientific stance. There is, of course, now a major public relations exercise going on. They're not talking anywhere about the emergence of resistance in weeds, because that's too obvious in this country, 17 million acres, so they're keeping quiet about it. But they keep talking about feeding the world. And in feeding the world, they're not talking about the herbicide-tolerant and Bt toxin crops. They're jumping into new fictions of a golden rice that will save blindness, which on our studies shows it's hundreds of % less efficient in giving you vitamin A than other sources of vitamin A, like our coriander and our curry leaf and the spinach and the amaranth and the moringa. There is no limit to how much vitamin A we can grow, as long as we grow in our gardens and our farms. And that's really what is at contest here with your vote. Will food and farming grow in the direction which is, any case, bringing us most of the nutrition and all of the food? Or are we going to go the path where we already are only 10% for corn and soya and only 30% for other food items, with a 75% destruction of the planet? And just do the calculations. If 75% of the planet has to be destroyed for providing 30% of the food, by the time we try and expand industrial farming, now based on GMOs, up to 40, 45%, we'll have a dead planet. That's what your GMO labeling law is calling to prevent, that we can't survive on a dead planet. And your labeling law is a very, very thin wedge to allow a transition for others. Through your demand for the right to know, you are creating a call for the right to live for all life forms, all biodiversity, and other human beings. Your freedom to know is so deeply connected with the freedom of Indian farmers to have their seed sovereignty, to grow food ecologically and not get into debt and have to commit suicide. That's the kind of work we do in Navdanya. That's the movement I've been building. That's the movement that invited Will and Allen in 2000 and 2004. And the farmers who work with us are earning between 5 to 10 times more by having their own seeds and growing food ecologically, through intensifying ecology and ecological processes, not chemical toxins, through intensifying biodiversity and not monocultures, through intensifying the knowledge of farmers and the knowledge of citizens, rather than growing ignorance at every level. Industrial agriculture and GMOs as intrinsic to that agriculture in 2014 is an agriculture based on ignorance. It's ignorance on the part of those who are shooting genes because they don't know where the genes are going, what they're doing to the structure of the organism. And then there's this attempt to be ignorant about impacts through substantial equivalence. Don't look, don't know. Then there's the attack on your right to know. You got to be ignorant about what you eat. This culture of ignorance cannot be the foundation of food security. We need knowledge intensity, but ecological knowledge. I wrote a piece a few months ago because there's an attempt to create one agriculture for the whole world. And the project is called One Agriculture, One Science, locking in every agriculture university around the world, particularly Africa, and all the international centers, based on one science. Every part of this planet is so diverse. How can you have the same agriculture in the desert and wetlands? How can you have the same agriculture in the tropics and your cold climate? Those monocultures were able to expand because of the subsidies that came from our tax money and because of the subsidies that come from fossil fuels. That's not going to be available in the future. So a true agriculture is based on true costs. And we've just released a new book, our agriculture minister released it, and we call it Wealth Per Acre, where we've counted all the externalities of chemical agriculture in India. It's 1.6 trillion. And we haven't counted many because the data isn't available. We've only calculated those for which government statistics was available. We earlier did a study called Health Per Acre because food is supposed to be about nourishment and health. Food today has become the single biggest cause for ill health. And you know, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, you'd think it's your neighborhood grocery. You know, the Grocery Manufacturer Association is the association that is so singularly responsible for bringing junk food to the world. Something humanity never did to itself. And there are those who think that the rest of the world should be forced with this. I mean, every day in India we have these issues. We work to get our schools free of junk food and the soft drinks. You heard the story about Coca-Cola. So what you've done here is so significant in every direction. And given that it grew from the grassroots, but it involves your legislature, it involves your government, it will involve your courts. And I did read the response. You know, reading what the industry is writing and reading what the response of the Attorney General is, such a different quality of content, of sense, of law. The other one only has, this is a complete ban on our speech. And they carry on to say, you can't prohibit us. But this is not about prohibition, it's about disclosure, which is a right of citizens. The industry would like a system where they are deregulated, where they can continue to pollute and harm our health. And they would like a system where they overregulate citizens, either through intellectual property rights which prevent farmers from saving seeds, or from new seed laws that have started to affect seed libraries in this country. It's begun in Pennsylvania and Maryland, where seed libraries, where people go put their seed in the library and then take it and return it, and it's an exchange system, they've been served notices. You can't save these seeds because there are new 2004 seed laws. Because not having managed to spread GMOs across the world, not having managed to stop people seeking to build their alternatives based on seed freedom and food freedom. Seed freedom means you save your seeds, you defend your right to save seeds and exchange seed. Food freedom means the right to know what you're eating and to be able to exercise your choice. Having failed to spread GMOs, they now want to contain the freedom of people by banning safe food, reliable seed that has been tested over hundreds of years of cultivation. And the irony is that is being called agri-terrorism, and releasing untested GMOs is considered safety. The GMO labeling issue here in Vermont has pinned it down. It's brought it from the abstract to the real. It's brought it from the corridors of lobbying and millions and billions of money floating to rural Vermont, where those lobbyists couldn't reach. The transforming of the food system at this point that you have triggered here. I remember in physics, there used to be this thing of Archimedes saying, give me a place to stand and I'll shift the world. Because if you have a place to lever, then you can shift the world. This is the place where you're shifting the world. You're shifting the world from industrial agriculture to ecological, from corporate control to food democracy. You're then opening the doors for all the movements around the world to join together in this movement at this point, to rejuvenate soil and water and biodiversity, reverse climate change, rejuvenate our health, and most importantly, rejuvenate our democracy, which is one democracy of the earth.